I lived with my father on the outskirts of a small town. We argued constantly and I was desperate to get away. So as soon as I was old enough, I joined the army. Military life suited me. I served for 8 years and was going to re-enlist when I heard from a friend who had been in my unit. He had left the army the year before and was now working for a private security company. They were looking for new recruits with military experience, and my friend said that he would recommend me if I was interested. This job in the private sector sounded like a fantastic opportunity, not least because there were seriously big bucks on offer. After a sleepless night, I made a decision. It was time for me to move on. My new employers arranged a hotel for me to stay in while I looked for an apartment. The hotel was classy and all expenses were paid. I must admit, after all the years in army barracks, the hotel felt strange at first. The room was too large and too quiet. The bed was too big and too soft. After sleeping badly, I made the bed every morning before leaving for work. I knew the hotel paid staff to do this while I was out, but this was a force of habit. I had left the army, but the army had not left me. My first few days at work were also mind-numbingly boring, as I attended a series of induction meetings and presentations. I tuned out and I learned absolutely nothing. Thankfully, I was then given my first assignment. I was part of the bodyguard detail for a mega-rich celebrity. When it came down to it, the man was a spoiled brat who made frequent appearances in the tabloids with his drunken bad behavior. If he had been an ordinary Joe, he would have ended up in jail. But money clearly talked. On my second week as a part of his entourage, I had to help him out of a nightclub by a back entrance to try and avoid yet another sleazy photograph of him appearing. He was so intoxicated that he had no idea where he was and he vomited on my shoes. I lost my temper and I called him a jerk. I shouldn't have spoken to a client of the company like this, no matter how odious they were. But at that moment in time, I did not care. I started to wonder if leaving the army had been the right thing to do after all. And to make things worse, the next morning I was called into a meeting with my supervisor. I assumed someone had reported me for speaking out of turn to a client, but when I walked into the office, I saw the old comrade who had brought me on board drinking coffee with my supervisor. They both seemed relaxed and greeted me with smiles and handshakes. I was offered a coffee and boy was it good. We settled into sofas placed around a glass table and my supervisor asked me how it was going. I had figured out by now that none of the other bodyguards had complained about me. Thinking on it, they had probably felt the same way that I had. So I said what I thought my supervisor wanted to hear. It's going great. His smile grew wider and he turned to my old comrade. A scar ran across one of his cheeks. I had been with him when he had been injured. Afterwards, he had saved my life. In the chaos of conflict, these things came thick and fast, but the memory stayed. I liked him and trusted him, and I listened attentively as he spoke. I've been authorized to tell you that the company has won a new contract. Financially, it's huge. It will take the company to a new level. It is also something that is on a strict need-to-know basis. Is that clear? I said without hesitation. Very. He took another drink of his coffee before continuing. Good. The company will be taking over a job that used to be carried out in-house by a government agency. We will be hunting down monsters wherever they're found. They are to be taken alive and transported to a government facility to be studied. And we want you on that team that will be out there in the field facing monsters. What do you say? Yes or no? I was not sure what to do. This was outside anything that I had ever imagined and I needed to know more. I asked, what happens if I say no? I could see the disappointment in his eyes. I guessed that he had recommended me to his superiors to work on this new contract, and if I turned it down, it would reflect badly on him. After a moment where he appeared to compose himself, he said, "If you say no, your memory of this meeting will be chemically wiped and you can go back to babysitting clients with more money than sense." "And if I say yes?" I asked. He wrote a figure on a piece of paper on the desk and spun it around so that I could read it. There were a lot of zeros. "That is the bonus you'll receive for every successful mission," he told me. I pursed my lips and whistled quietly. "In that case," I said, "count me in." I left the meeting feeling good. I had been attracted to this job in the first place by the salary, and now I was in line to earn even more. And I was going to be facing real challenges. There would be no more spoiled brats for me. I decided to celebrate by buying a new suit to replace the cheap one that I had bought at the mall when I left the army. I knew of a place within walking distance of the office and figured there was no time like the present. I purchased an Italian-made black wool-lined suit. It was like crazy expensive. Back out on the seat, I dropped my old suit in a trash can and set off to buy some new shoes. I hadn't gone so far when my company phone rang. It was my supervisor. He got straight to it. "There's been a sighting of a possible monster. The location is being sent to you now. Attend immediately. Capture the creature and await transport to take it to the secure government facility." I began to ask for more details, but he ended the call. I checked the address. It was a short cab ride away. I brushed a bit of dust off the sleeve of my new suit and then raised my arm to hail a ride. 20 minutes later, I stepped out of the cab and saw the location that I had been given was in a side street. There were 3 men wearing overalls standing around an open manhole in the road. I double-checked that I was in the right place, and there did not seem to be a mistake, so I strode up to the men and asked them for a sit-rep. I was still in the dark but knew from past experience that if you acted like you knew what you were doing, people would often cooperate. All 3 men gave me a filthy look, and then one of them said in a distinctly unhelpful tone of voice, "The situation is that we're not going back down there until that thing's taken care of, whatever it is." His friends grunted in agreement. "Yeah, we're not paid enough as it is to do our job anyway," the man went on. Still trying to get some clarity on the situation, I asked, "And what exactly is it that you do?" He looked at me like I was stupid and then answered, "We work for the city. We're sewage network engineers." I looked at the open manhole cover and understanding dawned on me. The thing they must have seen and reported, the thing that I was there to capture, was in the sewer system underneath the city. I smoothed down a non-existent crease in my new suit and thought how there was no way that I could go down into a sewer. I took out my phone and called my supervisor. "I'm on site," I told him. "The potential monster is in the sewer. I need you to dispatch a team wearing protective gear to go down there. I will supervise from the street level." I heard his intake of breath down the line loud and clear, and then he growled, "Look, we told the government that we could deal with any situation quickly and efficiently. If we don't, we're going to lose the contract. Get your butt down into the sewer and handle this yourself. And do it now." He ended the call. It looked like I had no choice. I thought maybe that I could borrow some overalls from these city workers and get some more information from them. But while I had been on the phone, they had gone to sit in their van. I knew that there was no point asking them for any kind of help. I was on my own. Sighing, I began to descend the metal ladder affixed to the side of the manhole. It was dark and the stench of the sewer was rising up to meet me. I reached the end of the ladder and found myself on a brick walkway in a tunnel. It was there that I had my first stroke of luck. There was a pile of equipment on the walkway. It had presumably been abandoned by the workers as they got out of there in a hurry. I retrieved a large flashlight and a metal crowbar. This would have had a specific use in the sewer, but I wanted it as a weapon. I still had no idea what I was about to face, but odds were it was not going to be friendly. Feeling marginally better, I advanced along the walkway. It ran alongside and just above the channel carrying the waste. I wouldn't describe this as being liquid or being solid. It was some grotesque state in between. It was flowing, but so slowly that it was possible to think that I was just sitting there, a foul, fetid concoction. I had no idea what was in there. I mean, I knew what the obvious constituents were, but what else might have found its way down into the sewer? There could be blood and bile, maybe even small body parts that needed disposing of for horrendous reasons. And like everyone else, I had heard urban tales of gators that had been kept illegally as pets and then disposed of when they started to get too big. The thought of the monster being a gator that had grown to full size down in the sewer while feeding on rotten human flesh filled me with dread. Hoping beyond hope that the city workers had imagined the whole thing, and there was nothing for me to fear, I trudged on. It was claustrophobic down there on top of everything else. The ceiling of the tunnel was only inches above my head, and I realized there was some kind of growth on it that I must have brushed against. My hair was full of a sticky fungal material, which was now on my hands and on the shoulders of my suit. As I was noticing this, I saw that I had also got a different type of gunk on one side of my trousers. No amount of dry cleaning would help, I knew that. I decided that I did want there to be a monster down in the sewer after all, one that I could hunt down and capture. I needed the bonus to make up for the ruined suit. Trying not to puke as the smell of the sewer grew even worse, I carried on with my search. I pointed the beam of the flashlight into the darkness of the waste. There didn't seem to be anything living in there beyond microbes, but then I saw the movement ahead. I paused and tried to hold the flashlight steady, but my hand had started to shake and the beam danced unsteadily over the waste. I still held the crowbar in my other hand and I didn't want to put it down to hold the flashlight with both hands. I told myself to get a grip. I had faced danger in combat zones as a soldier and to overcome my fear, but this was different. In the army, I always had my comrades by my side. Here, I was alone and dealing with the unknown. This was the thought that filled my mind as the beam from the flashlight revealed a shape in the waste. It emerged from the sewage and stood about 5 feet tall. I thought at first it was one dark being that was moving frantically, as if it was possessed. And then I saw tails flickering in the flashlight, and yellow fangs and red eyes. With a jolt of horror, I realized I was not looking at a single creature, but at dozens of huge rats writhing around to create a grotesque, feral mass. There must have been more under the surface of the waste, forming the base of the hideous display, while the rats on top crawled over each other. I had no idea why the disgusting rodents were behaving in this way, but as I watched them, the mass grew in number and became ever more frantic. Rats began to be dislodged and fell back into the sewage. Some landed on the walkway and began to scurry towards me. I raised the crowbar even though I knew with what was left of my reason that there were too many rats for me to face down on my own, and their number continued to grow. Within what felt like seconds, there was a tide of rats heading my way. I braced myself. If I fell, I would be lost beneath hundreds of rats. Their sewer-coated fur would press against my face and their tails would strike me. And then they would begin to bite. The first scent of blood released would send them into a greater frenzy, and they would tear me apart. As the rats rushed around my legs and scrambled over my feet, I used every ounce of willpower to stand my ground. For some reason, though, they were racing past me and not attacking. I couldn't see that lasting. Even if I had managed to stay standing, surely the first bite was only seconds away. I gritted my teeth and waited for the inevitable. But the rats kept rushing around me and they seemed to be thinning out. A hoarse, desperate laugh escaped my lips. Was I going to survive? Was I going to leave this strange, terrifying place unscathed? And then I saw something new. It was following in the wake of the rats, and I understood the rats' behavior. They had been running away from this. It had been a man once, but now it was an abomination. It was standing up to its waist in the sewage, its skin covered with scales. Its eyes were dark, primal orbs, and its teeth were cracked and sharp. They looked like shards of glass. As I stared open-mouthed at the monster, it reached out and grabbed one of the last of the rats, and then it tore with its teeth. Blood flowed down the scales on its chin as it devoured. The rat's tail was the last thing to disappear into its mouth, and then the monster looked up. It peered past the flashlight and straight at me. I could tell that it was sizing me up, maybe wondering if I would make a good meal. Its mouth opened in a smile laced with dark desire, and it began to wade through the waist. Now it was closer. I could see that it had openings in the side of its head where a man's ears should have been. So it might have been able to hear me if I ordered it to surrender. It might have understood me. It might even have complied. But I was not going to take the chance. I raised the crowbar and got ready to strike. The monster was too quick though. Its arm shot out, it grabbed my ankle and pulled me into the waist. Instinctively, I clamped my mouth shut. I knew that if I swallowed any of the sewage, I would be poisoned, and that would have led to a slow and agonizing death. The monster wanted to end my time on this earth much sooner. As I landed on my back and waist, splashed around me, it clamped its filthy hands around my neck and began to squeeze. I thrashed around trying to break free, but it was too strong. Drool dripped from its open mouth and its vicious teeth glistened as it loomed over me. I felt myself starting to pass out, and I knew that I only had one chance. I used the last of my strength to bring my knee up into its gut, and this did the trick. Its grip on my neck loosened. I rolled away, managed to find my footing on the base of the tunnel, and then I struck. I brought the crowbar down onto the top of its skull. There was a sickening crack and the monster went limp. Gasping with exertion and still doing my best not to get any of the sewage in my mouth, I put my hands under its armpits and hauled the prone form up onto the walkway. And then I dragged it backwards towards the manhole. Thankfully, it was out for the count and it didn't put up any fight. When I reached the manhole, I saw a beam of light shining down from the street. I hollered up and a voice called back, identifying themselves as a company man. It seemed my supervisor had sent backup after all. He helped me carry the monster back into the daylight. As we lay it on its back in the road, he said, "We're meant to take them alive so that they can be studied. A government vehicle has already been dispatched to collect it and take it back to their facility." I did not like his attitude. "It's knocked out, not dead," I informed him. Though if I had killed it, that would have been justified. It was the monster or me. He still wasn't convinced and had a sneer fixed on his face as the government transport turned up and three hard-faced figures got out and then carried the monster into their vehicle. I watched it pull away with the strange specimen. The other company man was still being a jerk. He also had a car and I needed a lift, so I was not calling him out. He unlocked the car and I climbed in. I moved toward the passenger door, but as I reached out for it, he locked the doors. "Yeah, no way you're getting in my car. You'll get sewage all over the seats." He started the engine and drove away. I gave him a one-fingered salute and then set off on the long walk back to the hotel. The doorman refused me entry at first, and I had to promise him a serious tip before he let me in via a door where the refuse was taken out. After throwing away my new and utterly ruined suit, I had to suffer the indignity of being hosed down by a cleaner. I changed into some old clothes that were found for me, and only then could I go up to my room. I fell onto the bed and was staring at the ceiling when the phone by the bed rang. It was my supervisor.
"Why are you not answering your phone?" he snapped.
My company phone was as ruined as my suit, and I had left it in a jacket pocket. I was about to explain this, but wasn't given the chance.
"And why are you not at the office? I need your report of the incident on my desk so that I can check it and send it on to the government. They need all the details as a part of their evaluation of the monster."
I closed my eyes and massaged my forehead.
"That's not good enough."
My supervisor bawled and then hung up. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. This is the pits, I said to the empty room, and then went to have a very, very long and hot shower. Wearing clean, everyday clothes and holding an extra large takeaway coffee, I headed back to the office. I wrote up my report and I emailed it. I did not get a response about that, but I did get a notification that a payment had been made into my bank account. I checked it out and saw that I had been paid my bonus. Sipping the coffee, I figured the corporate life was not all that bad. And when I was summoned into a meeting in one of the conference rooms, I once more had a spring in my step as I made my way there. My supervisor was seated around a long table with a group of men that I didn't recognize. One was writing something on a laptop. The rest were staring at a screen on the wall. The image shown on it took my breath away. It was of the monster that I had captured in the sewer. The thing was strapped to a body-length board. The restraints looked unbreakable. Well, I hope so anyway, with the way the monster was struggling to get free. As it fought, a voice off-screen said, "Stay still, this is your final warning." The monster paid no heed, and seconds later, its entire body tensed and cried out in agony, and then it slumped back against the board while smoke drifted off its scales. I had seen something like this once before on the deep web. It was what had happened when an electric current was passed through a body. This monster survived the shock and it was subdued, for now. It was air-conditioned in the conference room, but still I wiped away a bead of sweat. And then I realized my supervisor was looking at me suspiciously. "I hope you're not feeling any sympathy for that thing," he asked, his voice cold. "No," I replied quickly. "It tried to strangle me and would have likely consumed me if it had had its way." That was the truth, but I still wasn't comfortable with what I was witnessing. I knew that I better put on a poker face to hide this, and fast. "Good," my supervisor said. "The government is giving us access to the video feed of the monster's interrogation, which is taking place at their facility. So watch and learn." I focused on the image of the monster. As I did, the voice off screen said, "Tell us why you're here." I didn't know if the speaker was in the room with the monster or observing from a different location in the facility, but they were clearly leading the interrogation. The monster did not respond to their question, and I was wondering if it even could when it growled. There was no sense in the sound though, no words. The interrogator tried again. "Tell us why you're here." And now the monster found its voice. "I was driven from my home," it snarled. "There is a feud between my family and the Clancys who lived along the river from us. The feud went back generations, and the tales of what started it varied depending on how much moonshine the old men and women had drunk. Apart from the feuding, we were no different than the other folk in the area. And then chemicals were dumped in the river and they changed my family and the Clancys. We turned into monsters and we had to hide awake from regular folk. But even with all that, the two families continued to fight. It was vicious. I'm talking eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. In the end, the Clancys killed all my kinfolk, and I knew that I had to get out or else they would have slaughtered me as well. I made my way to the coast under the cover of darkness and found an outlet from the sewer. I crawled into it and I walked for days in the darkness until I could hear the city over me. I figured I could make a new start here. There was plenty of rats to eat, and I thought I could avoid regular folk, but I got careless and I was seen by men who were fixing the sewer. I guess that's the end of me. To my amazement, a tear rolled down the monster's scaly cheek. It was still a hideous freak, but it was alone in the world and in exile, and the questioning was not over. "Tell us where you came from," the interrogator asked. When the monster didn't respond straight away, another question followed. "How many are there in the Clancy family?" The monster shook its head. It was done answering, I figured. But still, the questions kept coming. "What is the name of the river? Why do you claim it was chemicals that changed you into monsters?" When the questions remained unanswered, the interrogator must have lost what little patience they had. Another electric current ravaged the monster's body. I turned away, not wanting to watch, and I waited for my supervisor to ask me what my problem was. But his attention was all on the laptop and the conference table. He was nodding and looking pleased. "Good work," he murmured to the man whose laptop it was. And then he looked up at me and said, "We have a lead. The company has invested massively in AI-powered resources, and a search of county records online has unturned 2 neighboring families who seem to have disappeared off the face of the earth 20 years ago. The Clancy family and the Hogg family. Animals and tourists have also been going missing nearby over the last 2 decades. No remains have ever been found. I'm going to call my contact at the government and inform him that we're going to find these monsters and capture them in the next 24 hours. He'll be very impressed." The grin on his face as he said this was manic. My expression was more downbeat, because I had the sinking feeling that I knew who was expected to deliver on this wild promise. My supervisor was already hurrying out of the room. He halted for an instant in the doorway, looked back at me and said, "Why are you still here?" Hating that I had been proved right, I pushed myself to my feet. 6 hours later, I was stepping off a company plane into a stifling heat. My clothes were already sticking to my skin by the time that I had walked down the steps. The plane had landed at a small private airfield, and I could see the car waiting for me just beyond its gates. While I was in the air, calls had been made to arrange for local law enforcement to meet me and provide every assistance needed. I did not know what they had been told from the sour expression on the deputy's face as he slumped against the side of his car. He was not impressed at having to help an outsider from the city. I squared my shoulders, walked confidently over to him, and held out a hand to shake. He looked at my palm as if he might catch something from it, spat a lump of chewed tobacco on the ground at my feet, and then opened up the patrol car and got in. I kept my thoughts to myself and climbed into the passenger seat. I was hoping to get this over with as soon as possible and get back to the city with monsters secured and transport arranged for them to the government facility. I was also hoping that the patrol car had air conditioning. It did not. My skin prickled with heat as the car pulled away. The deputy stared ahead, acting as if I wasn't there. It was harder for me to ignore him. He stank of stale sweat. And being in the car with him was not as bad as being in an actual sewer, but it was still horrendous. I tried to take my mind off the rank odor by focusing on the passing scenery. This consisted of wooden houses and barns. Some were boarded up, others should have been. There was a store with fruit and vegetables for sale in baskets outside. Flies swarmed over the fruit and the vegetables looked shriveled. There was roadkill every couple of miles. The exposed innards of the corpses glistened in the sun. We passed a diner as well that looked like a breeding ground for bacteria. I was not that surprised when the deputy pulled over and went in, but I was still angry that time was being wasted. However, I believe that ordering him to get his butt into gear would have backfired, and he would have plain refused to help me. So I counted to 10 a bunch of times and watched through one of the less greasy windows as the deputy passed the time of day with a gap-toothed waitress. I also tried to convince myself that I didn't need to use the restroom, but I was desperate. I considered going by the side of the road. It would not have lowered the tone of the place, but there was absolutely no shelter, so I had no choice. I went into the diner. The lone ceiling fan was a slowly spinning graveyard for flies. Linoleum peeled off tables that looked like they had not been cleaned in decades. The floor was worse. My feet stuck to it as I walked towards the restroom. I opened the door with my elbow and I went through. It smelled like something had died in there. Well, this was because something had died in there. I did what I needed to do and I got out. I returned to the car and sat there grinding my teeth until the deputy finally returned. He belched loudly, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and then started the car. The road narrowed over the miles that followed, and the sparse, rundown buildings were replaced on both sides of the road by dense undergrowth. The tangled stalks began to overhang the tarmac and seemed to me to be leeching the light out of the day. We drove on through a shade that chilled my bones, until eventually the road petered out into a dirt track, and the deputy slowed and parked up. "End of the line," he muttered. It was the first thing that he had said to me. Fighting to keep my temper in check, I told him. So we walked the rest of the way. He shook his head, nice and slow as a nauseating smile spread across his greasy face. "Not me, buddy. My shift's over in an hour and it'll take me that long to drive back to the station. But I'll be sure to ask the sheriff if he can spare another officer to head out to be your chauffeur." The way he said chauffeur was loaded with disdain, and I had had enough of him and his attitude. I climbed out of the patrol car, then leaned back in and said, "Don't bother. I'm better off without you losers, and the sooner that I get out of this stinking Inbred county, the better." I left the door hanging open and I walked away. I heard him cuss me and then the sound of the patrol car speeding away. As I began to follow the dirt track, I said a few choice words of my own. The track grew more and more narrow, and at points it was blocked by branches. I thought at first this was storm damage, but then I saw that some of the wood had been cut by a blade. It seemed that someone further along the track didn't want any visitors. Someone or something. I scrambled through the obstacles, ripping my clothes and scratching my face along the way. The heat was even worse in the grip of the undergrowth, and I started to find it hard to breathe. I fought on, spitting out bugs that had flown into my mouth and cursing my supervisor now. At last, I saw the clearing up ahead. A long, low wood cabin stood alone in the space. A tire lay on its side in weeds leading up to the porch steps, a rocking chair right next to it, and there was a shotgun as well. As I moved closer, a lizard crawled out of one of the barrels. I wish I could say that this did not make me jump, but it did. I shook my head, told myself to get a grip, and went into the cabin. Flimsy-looking blinds had been drawn down over the windows that I could see. The heat and the damp and the years had rotted the blinds in places, and light shone through in ragged beams. It revealed furniture riddled with woodworm and empty bottles strewn across the floor. From the labels that were left, they had once held strong liquor. A hunting knife was stuck in a wall. From the marks on the bare wood, it looked like the knife had been thrown at the wall numerous times. And getting blind drunk and throwing the knife must have been how they passed the evenings in this misbegotten place. I'd be watching some of the shows on TV, I thought with a smile, and I moved through to the kitchen. There was a large, filthy stove, and there was a raccoon curled up asleep on top of it. I left the raccoon to its dreams of garbage cans and carried on into what must have been a bedroom. A cracked, dust-encrusted mirror stood against one wall, and rags strewn across the floor around a bed. A corpse lay on the bed. It was grotesquely decomposed. Its eyes were gone, and the stump of a tongue showed through jaws that hung open, revealing sharp and cracked teeth. The scales that covered its skin were still visible, though they too were badly decomposed. I assumed that this poor soul was a member of the sewer monster's family, one of those killed in the feud with the Clancy clan. I turned away, sickened by the sight, and walked through the rest of the cabin. There were more rooms cluttered with signs of lives lived in poverty and grime. There were no more bones inside, but when I stepped out of the back door, I saw multiple bones scattered across a strip of land that looked out over a slow-moving river. There were skulls and rib cages and smaller bones from a number of individuals that were all jumbled together. There were bite marks clearly visible on some of the bones, and I had the grisly feeling that the meat on the bones had been consumed and then discarded. This, it seemed, was more of the sewer monster's family. Killed, consumed, discarded by their sworn enemies. I clenched my fists and fought against the nausea rising inside me. When I had got a degree of control, I made my way unsteadily to the river. I was going to splash a little of its water on my face and try and cool down, but the minute that I looked into the river, I backed away. The river was covered in a film of green slime, and there were no bugs hovering over the water, and no sign of any life in the river itself. The sewer monster had not given any details on where the chemicals might have come from before they were dumped in the water 20 years ago. Whoever committed this crime would have covered their tracks at the time. They would have made sure that there was no paper trail and bribed local officials if they needed to. I doubt the people responsible ever imagined so many lives would be tainted, and that one day a monster hunter would be on the trail of a strange and dangerous family created by their actions. I put these thoughts to one side and started following the river to where I both hoped and dreaded that I would find the Clancy family. I was not going to tackle them single-handedly. When I had a confirmed location for the monsters, I would backtrack to a place that I had a signal on my phone and call in reinforcements from the company. They would have to travel here, but unlike the local law enforcement, at least I knew my colleagues would get the job done. Keeping my senses as sharp as I could in these stifling conditions, I walked on. 20 minutes or so later, I saw another cabin standing in its own clearing and facing the river. Smoke drifted from a chimney and I could see movement inside. It appeared that the Clancys were in, but I had to make sure. I snuck closer. Keeping low, I sneaked a look through a window, and I saw a fresh nightmare unfolding. A man and a woman were sitting back to back on a bare wooden floor. They were bound together by ropes, and they both looked terrified. I couldn't blame them. A monster with scales on its skin was sharpening a knife on a stone. Another monster was watching a pot bubbling on a stove. Beyond them, I could just about make out more of the abhorrent family. They were sipping from liquor jugs and laughing, presumably in anticipation of the feast. Though I hadn't thought about it too much, I had assumed the sewer monster's family had been eaten raw back at their cabin. It seemed the Clancys were planning on making some kind of stew from their latest victims. I cursed silently. I could not go and call in reinforcements now. By the time they arrived, the bones of this poor couple would have been licked clean. I had to act. There was no intelligent course of action that I could think of in the spur of the moment. No tactical plan. I moved around to the door, straightened my shoulders, and I charged. I ran into the room screaming and collided with the monster holding the knife. It had seen me seconds before and had no chance to react. And now it fell sideways and dropped the knife. I caught it by the handle before it landed and I threw it at the monster by the boiling pot. My luck was in and I hit it in the throat. It staggered backwards, reaching for the blade embedded in a gap in its scaly flesh, and then it knocked the pot over. Scalding liquid hit the eyes of the first monster, which had been pushing itself back to its feet. It screamed in agony. The way fortune was favoring me for once, I was thinking that I should buy a lottery ticket after calling for reinforcements. But first, I had the rest of the clan to deal with. They were rushing into the room, still holding their jugs of hooch. I pulled the knife free and grabbed the now empty pot, and I went for it. I swung and slashed and kicked. It was me or them, and every ounce of rage I held exploded from within me. I took them all out and then stood there with my chest heaving and a grin on my face that must have looked insane. The couple, who were still bound and gagged, regarded me with a mixture of confusion and fear on their faces. "It's going to be okay," I told them. "You're off the menu." I untied them and then used the rope to secure a couple of the Clancys. There was more rope lying around the place, enough for me to ensure that none of the monsters would be going anywhere. One of them, the Clancy that I had thrown the knife at, did not need tying up. It was stone cold dead. I just knew that my supervisor would bawl me out for not taking all the monsters alive so that they could be studied, but I would deal with that later. For now, I wanted to get to a place where I could get a phone signal. After a hard trek back to the road with a couple in tow, I made the call. It was dark by the time the company helicopters flew into view, and they were such a welcome sight. I asked for the couple to be checked out by a medic, and then I gave directions to reach the Clancy cabin on foot. With this done, I lay down in the middle of the road. I was so tired I didn't even care anymore. I stared at the stars and I started to drift. I was fast asleep and dreaming about finding a human eye in a stew when I was shaken awake. One of the company men was pointing at a trio of SUVs that had arrived while I had been out. "Government transport," he growled. "They collected the monsters from their cabin and are taking them back to the facility to be studied. The government are short on numbers for such a large party of monsters. They want us to provide a guard, and you've been assigned." I looked at him in disgust, but before I could protest, he said, "Hey, that's an order that comes from the top." I knew the only way that I could get out of this was to resign, but until I got paid my bonus, I wasn't going to make any rash moves. I got to my feet and I staggered over to the SUVs. The vehicles had been converted into mobile cages, and the Clancy family were locked behind steel grills. They stared at me with malevolence burning in their dark eyes and clawed at their cages trying to get to me. If they had gotten free, they would have torn me limb from limb before anybody could come to my aid. I knew. A feeling like my nerves were shredded. I got in up front in one of the SUVs. The doors were slammed shut, and somebody banged on the side of the vehicle that I was in as a signal that it was time to roll. And then we set off. We drove through the night and at dawn pulled up at a truck stop. I was brought a coffee and a breakfast muffin, which I forced myself to eat even though I had no appetite. Nothing was given to the Clancys. I thought back to when we had set off and I couldn't recall seeing any water in their cages. I told myself that that wasn't my problem as we resumed the journey. Roughly 24 hours after we had set off, we pulled up outside a compound. In the darkness, I couldn't make out much of the surrounding area, but we must have been somewhere remote because I could not see the lights of any nearby buildings. A gate slid open and we moved slowly forwards into a large yard. I figured this was the government facility where the monsters were studied, but as I looked around, it felt more like we were in a supermax prison than a research center. Armed guards peered down at us from towers in the perimeter walls. Razor wire coiled along the tops of the walls in between the towers, and cameras tracked our movement as the SUVs were opened up. More armed guards swarmed out to escort the Clancys the short distance into a concrete building. There were no windows, and from my position next to the SUVs, I could see a long, dark corridor inside the building. A disgusting smell drifted out and something screamed. It didn't sound human, but it was in pain. I shivered. Ahead of me, the Clancys were being marched into the building. Their ankles and wrists were shackled and they looked close to collapsing. Despite their ragged state, one of them suddenly turned and threw itself at a guard. A taser left the monster on its knees and it was dragged the rest of the way, until I lost sight of it and the others in the darkness of the interior. There was one of the families still to be taken to Journey's End. I watched as the corpse of the monster that I had killed with the knife was carried inside. It was shown no respect. Its arms and head dragged in the dirt as if it was hauled by the legs. I turned away. I had had enough. I was one of a quartet of company employees who had traveled with the monsters. We were told 2 cars would be provided for us to drive back to our office. I did not wait for a discussion about who would go in which car. I got into one of the cars and drove off by myself. I needed some time alone. I was unsettled and unsure about my work as a monster hunter because of the appalling way that the monsters were being treated. But if I did leave, what could I do? Should I re-enlist or start a new career? I would basically be starting over. I just didn't know but hoped being on the open road would clear my mind and help me think. I drove all night. As dawn broke, I stopped at a roadside diner. It was the same as thousands of diners across the country, but compared to the last place that I had been in, it felt like a 5-star restaurant. I checked my phone when I left the diner. I had missed calls and messages from my supervisor. I also saw that I had been paid my bonus, which improved my mood, and I considered responding to my supervisor. But I decided that he could wait. And during the course of the night, I had found myself impulsively heading back to a place I never thought that I would go again, and now I was only an hour away. I was really not sure if this was a good thing to be doing. However, still being led by something deep inside, I started the engine and drove on towards my childhood home. I pulled over when the house came into sight. The house had never been anything special. It was a 2-story building with small yards out front and back and no neighboring properties. The last time that I had seen it had been when I left to join the army, and now it looked run down and uncared for. My father's old car was in the driveway in the same place that he had always parked it, but it too looked in a bad way. One of its tires was flat, and even from a short distance I could see that it was covered in a layer of dirt. I had had no contact with the old man since I had left the army. There had been too much bad blood between us, and I was too busy getting on with my own life. But seeing the house and his car, I figured things hadn't gone well for him. Like father, like son, I thought, and I felt an immense wave of sadness pass through me. I looked at the key in the ignition and told myself that this was achieving nothing. I had been right to move on from the situation with my father all those years ago, and I should just drive away. But I kept hesitating. What if the house was run down because he had gotten sick? Could I ever forgive myself if I got a message one day that he had died, and I hadn't seen him when I had the chance? And whatever else had happened, he was still my father, my flesh and blood. There was no one else. My mom had died when I was a child, leaving him to bring me up alone. That couldn't have been easy. As I sat there, I realized a tear was running down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I got out of the car and started walking towards the house. I had to see him, and do it now. I passed the mailbox, which was full to overflowing, and saw household garbage discarded among the weeds. The path hadn't been swept in a long time. The porch, when I stepped onto it, creaked with age. By the time I found myself at the front door, I was riddled with nerves. In a messed up way, this was scarier than the first time that I was in a combat zone. I raised a hand to knock on the door but saw that it was ajar. I tapped on the door anyway. When there was no answer, I tried again and said hesitantly, "Hello?" I wanted to add, "It's me." But I wondered if after all this time my father would recognize my voice. He certainly would not be expecting me. I took a deep breath and I pushed the door open. The hallway was dark. Dust motes illuminated by the light I was letting in hung in the air. As my eyes adjusted, I saw an old pair of boots standing just inside the door. I recognized them as the ones my old man used to wear when he was doing jobs about the house. They had reinforced toe caps and he had bought them secondhand. An incident that I hadn't thought about in years came back to me. The cops had brought me home one time for causing trouble in town. Because of my age, they didn't want to make it official, and they had left me with my father. He was raging, and after the cops had gone, he threw one of the boots at me. I was too quick on my feet back then, and I easily ducked out of the way. And then I had run off laughing along the hallway and out the back door. I looked at the boots, shook my head sadly, and then carried on along the hallway. All the shutters were closed and the air smelled stale. I stepped into the front room. The screen on the TV was covered in dust and mold grew on a pizza slice left on a plate. There was an empty bottle of bourbon on the floor next to it and a tumbler that was speckled with more mold. It didn't look like there had been anybody there in a long while. The kitchen was the same. I tried one of the taps. It rattled and then spat out drops of brown water. It was clear that there was nobody living in the house, and I wondered with a mounting sense of dread if I was too late. Had my dad passed away, leaving the house that I had grown up in abandoned? I couldn't accept that. Not yet. I forced myself to go upstairs, hoping desperately that I would find some sign that my father was still alive. At first, there was a silence broken only by the sound of my own ragged breaths. There was no movement on the landing. My childhood bedroom was at the end on the right. Before that was the bathroom and my father's room. I stopped outside this door, steeled myself, and I went in. The room was dark and strangely cold. There was an unmade bed, clothes on the floor, and something in the corner. I froze. Whatever it was, it just moved, and it was looking up at me. I would have cried out, but shock had robbed me of my voice. The thing in the corner was my father. He was different though. The man that I remembered was big. Muscles had turned to fat, but he had still had a powerful presence. As I looked at him now, with fresh tears stinging my eyes, he was hideously diminished. He was so skinny that I could see the sharp lines of his bones beneath the skin. They formed dark patterns over his face. He was a thing of shadows now. But perhaps, I thought, the darkness was playing tricks on me. I moved over to a shutter to open it. But before I could, my father spoke. His voice was a whisper. It was somehow both harsh and pathetic. "Do not do that," he said. "The light, it hurts." I moved my hands away from the shutter and said, "You are ill." It was the only thing that explained everything that I was seeing. I could see the shadows shifting, and he was shaking his head. No, I am not sick." I moved closer, knelt down so that we were eye to eye. "Dad," I said, "it's me. I've come home and I'm not leaving until you tell me what's wrong." The pale cavities that were his eyes studied me. "You," he whispered, "why are you here?" I tried to put a brave face on things and make it sound as if I was not terrified when I answered. "Well, that's a long story. I'll tell you it over a beer one day. But first, let's get you some help." His eyes drifted past me. "I'm beyond helping, son. Beyond this world as you know it. I belong to the darkness now." "I don't understand," I said. He drew in a breath and then once more looked me in the eye and began to speak. "It was a few months ago when the nights were warm and clear. After work and my dinner, I would sit on the porch with a glass of bourbon. It took the edge off and it helped me sleep. It was rarely just one drink, and on the night that everything changed, I was about to go in to get a refill when I noticed something strange in the sky. I saw dark wings framing the form of a man. I panicked, not understanding what this creature was and why it was heading towards me. I could only sit there and stare dumbly as the creature reached the porch and stood in front of me. It was smiling, a smile that made me want to scream. And behind the smile, I could see the tips of fangs. They were sharper than any blade I had ever seen, and I knew in my guts what it was going to do. I leaned forwards and it bit deep. Pain flared from my neck where its fangs had pierced, and I felt myself passing out. I believed these were my last moments on Earth, and all I could think about was that there would be nobody to grieve me. His voice trailed off. I was struggling to take in what he was saying, but I could tell that he was incredibly weak. I had to do something. "Let me get you some water," I said. He put his hand on mine and said, "I do not need water. I need blood." I was horrified. I knew now what he had become. "You're a vampire," I said. He nodded. "I woke up on the porch deep into the night, and the one who had transformed me was gone. I do not know if it meant to leave me its curse when it fed or if it was an accident. Either way, I doubt it cares or has even thought of me again. I'm not like it. I cannot take to the sky and roam through the darkness to sate my hunger. I am a shriveled wreck who exists off bugs and old rats that are too slow to escape even me." He laughed bitterly but began to choke. I fought against the physical repulsion that I felt and held him gently to try and help him recover. When he could breathe properly again, he looked at me and asked, "Why are you helping me?" I mean, what could I say? I was helping him for the same reason that I had come looking for him. "Because you're my father, the only one that I'll ever have. Now I'm going to get you some blood." I left the house and climbed into the car. There was nothing strange outside. I could see a truck on the road in the distance and the rooftops of the town a few miles away, but I knew that everything had changed. I started the engine and drove around the edge of town. I was headed for the ER at the small hospital which was used by the populations of a group of local towns and the people who lived scattered in between. I had been there a number of times when I lived at home. The first time was when I had fallen out of a tree that I had been climbing and broken my arm. The last time was not long before I left to join the army. I had been racing in a stolen car and had left the road at speed. I escaped unhurt, but my passenger had a concussion, so I had to take them to the ER. I didn't want to hang around and have to answer any difficult questions, and I had been leaving via a quiet corridor when I noticed a door leading to a storeroom. A nurse was standing at the door entering a key code into the lock, and I saw the number that she had used over her shoulder. I waited until she had collected what she needed and left, and then I entered the number in myself and sneaked in. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just doing this because I knew that I shouldn't. That was how I was wired back in those days. I found myself in a long, narrow room crammed with shelves full of medical equipment. There was a large, glass-fronted case with drugs in it as well, but this was secured with a double lock that needed keys. There was also what looked to me like a large household freezer. I tried the door. It wasn't locked, and I opened it up and saw that it held sachets of blood. I would have taken some for a laugh, but at that moment somebody came into the storeroom. They got the shock of their lives when I pushed past them moments later and sprinted out of the hospital. Years later, I was back, and the hospital didn't seem to have changed at all, and I didn't have to wait long before somebody went into the storeroom. The key code that I saw being entered was different but easy to remember. This time, I took half a dozen sachets of blood and left the storeroom without being disturbed. I still needed to get off the premises without anybody realizing what I had done and calling security or the cops. With the sachets hidden precariously inside my jacket and my heart racing, I made my way along the corridor which led to the exit. I was almost at the door when a woman wearing medical whites just in front of me turned and saw me. Her eyes grew wide with surprise, and then she smiled and said, "Wow, I can't believe it's you." My luck, it seemed, had run out. I didn't need to look at her ID to know that the medic's name was Jennifer. We had went to high school together, and she had been beautiful then and still was. My head was spinning. She was still waiting for me to say something, and I managed to blurt out a hi. She responded brightly, "I heard you had joined the army, but after that you just seemed to disappear." I forced a grin onto my face and shrugged, as if that explained everything. She didn't seem put off and asked, "Are you back visiting your father?" Stupidly, I answered, "Yes." If I hadn't been so thrown by this unexpected encounter, I would have thought of a simple lie, but it was too late now. Before I dug myself deeper into a hole, I had to end this conversation. "Sorry, Jennifer, but I have to get going." And then I started to walk past her. "Is your father okay? Only he hasn't been seen in town for quite a while." Without looking back and trying to sound casual, I lied. "He's fine, thank you though." The last words she said to me as I went through the doors were, "Maybe see you around." No way, I thought, and I hurried for the car. After putting the sachets on the passenger seat and covering them with my jacket, I drove off. My nerves were so taut that I was driving erratically, and I was worried the cops might pull me over. More questions were the last thing that I needed. So when I felt that I had put a safe distance between me and the hospital, I pulled over at the side of the road. I sat there and tried to compose myself. I noticed that my work phone had slid out of my jacket pocket while I had been driving, and I remembered that I still needed to reply to my supervisor. I laughed bitterly. There was no way that I could go back to being a monster hunter now that my father had become a vampire. I picked up the phone and with shaky hands, I wrote an email and pressed send. I had resigned from the company. I kept it short and sweet, and I didn't give a reason. I knew the company would follow up on my email, but I wasn't interested. I turned the phone off and I started the engine back up. When I got back to the house, I ran up the stairs carrying the sachets. I put them on the ground next to my father and I stood back. He looked at me and said, "Can you open one for me? I'm too weak." Even in the gloom, I could see the shame in his eyes. I knelt down and tore one of these sachets open, and then I held it out. He took a hold of it with his fingers, but I was worried that he was so frail that he would drop it. So I supported the sachet as well, tipping it higher as he drank. When the sachet was empty, he rested his head against the wall and closed his eyes. "Better?" I asked. He nodded and then said, "I hate this room. It feels like a prison. Can you help me go downstairs?" "No problem," I told him and put my hands under his armpits to lift him. He was so diminished that I could have picked him up and carried him easily, but I just supported him instead as he walked slowly downstairs and into the front room. I settled him on the sofa. He looked around at the disheveled room and said, "I might need to hire a cleaner." He smiled at his joke and I saw a spark in his eyes. The blood was clearly making him feel better. I took 2 stairs at a time as I went to fetch the rest of these sachets. He drank another one and then his head sank forwards and he fell asleep. He seemed at peace and I went to sit on the armchair facing him. The room was still a tip, with an empty blood sachet discarded on the floor as well now, and my father had gotten blood on his mouth and chin and down his front from drinking it so quickly. None of that mattered to me at that moment in time. For the first time since I had been a young child, I was with my father and we were at peace with one another. I made a promise to myself that whatever happened, I would be there for him from now on. My eyelids flickered as tiredness caught up with me, and I was falling asleep when I heard the door opening. I was in such a daze that I did not react at first. And then I heard a woman's voice out in the hallway say, "Is there anyone in?" I sat up straight and swore to myself. It was Jennifer. I was still sitting there when the door opened and she walked into the front room. She saw me and said, "After I saw you at the hospital, I thought that I would call around to catch up properly with you and your father." I thought she was about to say more, but she fell silent as she looked around the room. In the gloom, she was noticing the mess and my father on the sofa. She moved closer to him and I could make out the confusion on her face as she saw how emaciated he was and the blood around his mouth and on his clothes. She turned slowly to face me and her eyes shone with shock. "I can explain," I said, but she did not want to listen. She started to back out of the room and I heard her hurrying back along the hallway. I put my head in my hands. I knew that she would call the police. Even though she did not understand what she had seen, I didn't blame her. There was horror here. I could have run out and stopped her, but I was not going to physically restrain her. She was innocent. I had to sort this mess out another way. My father was blinking awake. "Hungry," he mumbled. "You'll have to wait. We need to get out of here." I explained quickly what had happened, grabbed the remaining blood and a thick blanket from one of the rooms. It was still daylight and I knew my father couldn't be exposed to the sun, so I covered him with the blanket and I let him out to the car. I opened up the back door and I helped him in. I made sure that he was fully covered, put the blood under the blanket for him, and I drove off. I could see the front door hanging open in the rearview mirror, and I knew this would be my last sight of the house that I had grown up in. I wiped fresh tears from my eyes and I floored the accelerator. As I drove, I decided the best thing that I could do was to find somewhere isolated where we could hide while I worked out what to do next. The roads were already quiet and we were passing fewer and fewer buildings. There was a store coming up and I figured that I should stop to buy provisions for myself. I indicated and slowed and then saw the front of a police car parked up alongside the store. There were 2 officers in the car, both eating. They must have stocked up on snacks for their shift. I cursed my bad luck. There was no way they could stop at the store now. Hoping that they hadn't noticed me, I turned the indicator off and slowly increased my speed. It made no difference. The cop behind the wheel gave me a suspicious look. Moments later, they pulled out and started following me. I waited for their lights to start flashing and for them to tell me to pull over. But after a while, the cop car slowed and fell back. They were still following me, but they were keeping their distance. I felt sick as I realized why. They would have entered my license plate into the system and it would have identified as the government vehicle that I had driven away from the facility in. Further checks would have been made and the identity of the driver would have been revealed. The company would have been informed and learned about the report of a blood-stained figure in a dark, rundown house. Even if they hadn't worked it out, their AI would have. There is a monster out there accompanied by one of their former employees. It was a bad mix and the pursuing cops would have been told to back off because the company were going to take over. Any hope that I had had drained away. I drove on because I couldn't think of anything else to do. Darkness fell. The lights behind me were joined by the lights of another cop car. A helicopter started tracking me and the police vehicles waited at every potential turnoff. I had no choice but to keep on driving dead ahead until I saw the roadblock. Vans parked side on meant that this was the end of my journey, and as I slowed, I could see more vehicles closing in from behind me. I stopped before I reached the roadblock and swore out loud. "Dad!" I called over to where he still laid, covered by the blanket. "We've got trouble." He pushed the blanket away and slowly sat up. There was fresh blood on his lips, and I doubted there were any of the sachets left. My heart felt heavy as I thought how hunger would be the least of his problems when he was taken back to the government facility. I felt as well that I had failed him. "I'm so sorry, Dad," I said as he took in the vehicles and the armed figures who were now stepping out onto the road. "Don't be sorry, son," he said. "This isn't your fault." His gentle voice was followed by the harsh tones of words spoken through a speaker.
We are authorized by the government to take you into custody. Exit your vehicle and do not try and resist.
I believed that we would be cut down if we tried to fight or flee, and while we were breathing, maybe there was a sliver of hope. I told my father, "Best do what they say," and then I got out of the car. I held my hands out so that they could see that I was not armed. My father did the same, and as we stood there side by side, the company men began to approach. I looked at my father, wishing desperately that I could do something. He met my gaze and said, "I am not weak or afraid anymore, and it's not just because of the blood that I've drank. It's because my son came home." And then he began to change. His arms shimmered in the darkness and transformed into wings. I could see the lines of his veins pulsing beneath the pale surface of his skin, and I could see his sharp, powerful fangs as he opened his mouth and cried out into the night, "You will not stand in my way." And then he launched himself at the company men. They panicked and fell back behind their vehicles. This was my chance to get away, I knew. While all their eyes were on the ferocious and fearsome vampiric form, I ran off the road and kept running. No one shouted warnings for me to stop, and no bullets flew my way. I pounded across the deserted scrubland, breathing hard, determined that I wasn't going to be caught. I paused once and looked back, wanting to see my father one last time. And there he was. He was soaring over the company men on the road. He was a dark creature, a monster, and my father until the day that I died.
Nelson Asada, Dice Screaming, Meat Cashier, Malcolm Black, Talamagara, Justin Fotenauer, That One Woodsman, Die Can't Play, Dino, Deggy, MP Massacre 91, Leon Knott, SWAT, Kathy McGuire, Jimmy Griffin, Miss Eldridge, Dragon Slayer 048, Takeo Zarilla, Sanjay Anthem, Sleepy Shroomy, Mark Norman, Mina Gitter, Richard French, yours truly, Omni Rubix, Sonic GMD, Wayward Son, Caleb Windsor, Never Enough, Russell and Flo, Stevie B 7649, Ray Weingartner, Stephen King 04, Shrimpo the Shrimp, Genevieve Sweet, Lone Wolf Sam, Ivory Sage, Lunas TV, I Am Loki 5849, Chicago Born and Bred, Paige Martin, Jacob Barlett, Deuce, Chris Lalone,